Okay, I think we have a good number of attendees now, so I think we're ready to start. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brian Fitzgerald. I'm an actuary with Lane Clark and Peacock, and I'm a member of the Pensions Committee, and also actively involved with the CPD working group of the Pensions Committee. Thank you for joining us today on this lovely sunny afternoon. I'm looking forward to an interesting session. We have and hopefully with a good opportunity for audience engagement after the two presentations from our two speakers today. The two speakers that have kindly volunteered their time today with us are Tom Leahy and Rob Meany, two fellows of the SAI. And just to pick a couple of the items that they're going to be looking at, it's the risk management journey to date, the risk management outlook, supervisory review process. And then Rob is going to be updating on sustainability and climate change committee survey results, and also incorporating those sustainability topics into a risk management framework. Just a small bit of housekeeping before I hand over to our two presenters. Today's webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded to ActiveView and to the SAI's YouTube channel. And registration with your full name is sufficient for a CPD recording, and we will be applying for recognition of this webinar under the CPD schemes of the IOB as well as the LIA. As you know, the formal recording is not required for the SAI, but it is for other CPD schemes. At the end of the presentation, so I think we're going to have an opportunity for a good time for Q&A at the end. So you can submit any questions either during the presentation or during the Q&A session, or you can also raise your hand if you'd prefer to speak your question. Questions can be typed into the Q&A box. And as I said, we're going to wait for the end of the second presentation to get involved in your questions. Now, just to introduce our two speakers, as I have mentioned, the first presenter today will be Tom Leahy. Tom is the head of risk management at Unio since 2022, assisting trustees on their IORPS2 compliance journey and helping them maximize value from their risk management framework. Tom has extensive risk management experience in both the insurance and the reinsurance industries. And our second presenter will be Robert Meany. Robert is a principal and senior investment consultant at Mercer with over 15 years experience advising institutional clients on a range of investment consulting issues. He also has a keen interest in sustainability, working across a diverse client base in Ireland and in Europe. And Rob currently sits on the SAI's Sustainability and Climate Change Committee. So with that said, now I will hand over to Tom. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Brian. Yeah, as Brian said, great to see such a big crowd and people willing to forego a sunny lunchtime to join us on the webinar today. My presentation, from a risk management perspective, I suppose I have three aims really. The first one is to reflect on some observations since the introduction of the IORPS regulations through a risk key function holder lens. Secondly, to look at how risk management might evolve in the future. And lastly, to pose some questions that could potentially be further developed at future SAI events. So I suppose just looking at activities in the risk management space historically looked something like the following. So if we first look at the pre-IORPS go live, so pre-1 January 2023, what we would have seen is trustees are appointing risk manager key function holders providing fitness and probity documents, contracts, letters of engagement being put in place. We would have also seen a suite of IR policies being implemented that would, of course, include a scheme's risk policy. And I suppose in the period then between then and the 22nd of April 2024, risk key function holders would have been actively working with trustees to implement risk registers, risk appetite statements. And then I guess specifically, we're all familiar with the deadline of 22nd of April 2024. It's a date, I think, for risk KFHs that will be forever burned into our consciousness. But that deadline effectively for trustees to have in place critical reviews of their registered administrator and also their investment managers. And both of those reports would have fed into a final and signed off own risk assessment by that stage. Activities in the risk management space, I guess, up to 22nd of April 2024, when you look at this slide, I would conclude that ultimately they've been very regulatory driven. Just the next slide, Brian, please. So since the 22nd of April 2024, I suppose what we've seen is the risk key function holders are now providing a regular suite of reporting to trustees based on the provisions of the contract with the trustees. That would include the likes of risk dashboards, etc. In terms of own risk assessment recommendations and internal audit findings, so we are seeing the monitoring of those recommendations, and they're being implemented and closed out. Also, I think risk key function holders would have had some role to play in relation to DORA compliance, although that role is somewhat varied and varied depending on the requirements of the trustees. We're also now seeing internal audits kicking off on schemes risk management framework. So we're working hand in glove with internal auditors on that. And for some of us, we've been involved in supervisory review process on certain schemes in 2024, engaging with the Pensions Authority on that. Again, all of that stuff, it feels very much like all these activities are still in the risk management space, are still being very regulatory driven. So really, I suppose what I'm trying to get at here is what's the scope in the future for more industry-led initiatives and activities to take place in the risk space? And by that, I mean something that the industry is driving rather than merely a regulatory tick box exercise. So I think the first thing I would probably look at on that is just there are definitely some barriers, to industry-driven initiatives in this space. I mean, the most obvious one is cost, and it's a recurring issue for employers because IARPS has brought additional costs onto employers, and it's debatable how much appetite there is for any additional cost. There's also the flip side of that, which is the perceived value add from risk management, and that's something obviously that the risk KFH needs to demonstrate to the employer and trustees. The second barrier that I would see is maybe the lack of, historic industry risk management experience. So obviously, a lot of people will have taken on risk KFH roles who may not previously have had a lot of risk management specific experience. It could have been in various other fields which add very valuable insights, but it may not necessarily have been risk specific. So I think on that one, we can definitely leverage off, what and learn from Irish reinsurance and insurance industries in terms of the activities that they're undertaking, and look at bringing that into the pension scheme industry. And then the last point is just around, I suppose, the perception that anything over and above the regulatory minimum that you do, that it's more yellow tape that's inhibiting trustees from their day-to-day running of the scheme. And that is an attitude that's out there, and it's something that I think risk KFHs are going to have to challenge. Just on to the next slide, Brian, please. So what does pension scheme risk management look like into the future? I think firstly, it's always good to remind ourselves that it's the employer and the trustee's strategy that drives and spins the risk management framework wheel. That risk management life cycle, effectively, all that is an actuarial control cycle, but just working in the risk space. The risk management framework, I think, should always respond to changes in this key strategy. And that's the thing I always come back to in any additional area of work that you're looking at is, have you considered the strategy, and is it feeding into your risk management framework? Now, being a bit more specific, my own expectation is I think the pension scheme risk management will become more than that regulatory tick box exercise for many schemes in the future. The types of areas where I think the risk industry can add further value, and this isn't exhaustive, it's just a couple of obvious observations. So around stress and scenario testing, we know that the regulator has fed back around maybe a lack of engagement with trustees around areas that are immediately outside of the trustees' control. So I think stress and scenario testing can be very helpful here, looking at emerging risks, all that type of stuff. How do you go about quantifying that kind of stuff? There are very useful, UK, US quantitative models that are out there, and as always, Google is your best friend on this kind of thing. But it can certainly help you in terms of thinking about calibrating models, etc. if there's a specific risk that you really want to hone in on. Sustainability risk, Rob is going to cover that. I did know there's anecdotal evidence that that's not been deeply explored yet by actuaries or I would say risk managers as well. So Rob can take up the mantle on that point. There's also the identification and measurement of scheme risk interdependencies. So really what I'm talking about here is the potential for mass accumulations. So it's just rather than looking at risks individually, look at how they interact, and try and identify basically any accumulations that could develop. Cyber risk, obviously the digital operational resilience regulations are in place, and I think most schemes now will have certainly initial compliance steps put in place. But even outside of DORA, I do think that the risk KFH can certainly add value here by mitigating cyber risk via additional controls. So for schemes that are outside of DORA, I don't think that precludes you from identifying these additional controls. And even for pension schemes that are complying with DORA, I think you need to look through a broader lens than merely just DORA compliance. I do think there's extra work that can be done there. And the last one is around sponsor covenant risks. This is for defined benefit schemes. A deeper dive into sponsor covenant risk can certainly add significant value for the scheme stakeholders. And really what I'm talking about there is really getting into the nitty-gritty, interactions with the employer, documenting all of this. And it's not just on the financial, but getting into, what are the provisions in the trustee rules, what are the various powers, looking at the funding, looking at the sponsor covenant assessments through a very broad lens, and trying to bring all of that together for trustees. And I suppose my point on this is, if it's not the risk key function holder who's going to do that, then ultimately who is going to do it? And we might just move on to the next slide, Brian, please. So I just included here some observations on the inaugural own risk assessment process and the own risk assessment report here. So I'll start maybe with some of the challenges that we observed. I won't call all of these out in the interest of time, but I might just call out maybe the more striking ones to me. So we did find that early trustee engagement was sometimes challenging. So ideally, you wanted trustees to engage 18 months out from the deadline, when IARPS went live. In an awful lot of cases, that didn't actually happen, which led to, I suppose, a bit of a bottleneck towards the own risk assessment deadline. The hard deadline itself of the 22nd of April for all schemes, it did inevitably lead to a rush delivery for trustees. The critical reviews having the same deadline of the 22nd of April, it did cause significant headaches. There was a huge volume of information coming at trustees at the same time, which caused headaches. Late regulatory guidance as well. I'll come to regulatory engagement in a bit, but the regulatory guidance on this came out in the October before the deadline, at which point I guess most risk KFHs would have had a process and a plan in place for the own risk assessment for the majority of schemes. There was also that difficulty communicating a large amount of information to trustees over a short period of time. And I do know this is something that trustees really struggled with. They had all this information coming at them. They were trying to do their day-to-day running of the scheme. And in some cases, I do note that they fed back that it became almost impossible to run the scheme outside of IARPS compliance for a period of a couple of months in the lead up to the deadline. So that was not ideal. It was also fed back that there was a divergence of approaches in quantifying the financial and solvency risks. So various, risk key function holders using different approaches effectively, which was fine. But for a trustee of 50 or 100 schemes, seeing those differing approaches caused some headaches for trustees. Employer covenant assessment as well. What we did see in some cases is the responsibility for that falling on the risk KFH, because the ORA had to include effectively the assessment result of the strength of the employer covenant. So the whole process around that, if it wasn't being taken care of by somebody in order to finalise an ORA, it can be inadvertently fell on the risk KFH to do it. And probably one of the bigger points, certainly from the regulator's perspective, is were the trustees given sufficient review time for such lengthy documents? In all cases, arguably not. If the process just felt very rushed, large amounts of information going to trustees and then getting lengthy reports with not a huge amount of time for a challenge. They were the challenges, I suppose, that we observed. But just moving on, Brian, I suppose coming out of that challenging ORA production cycle, some of the benefits that I certainly now see coming through for schemes and ultimately its members is there's clear evidence to me of the ORA being a dynamic and, to use Brendan Kennedy's words, a living document at trustee meetings. And that to me is evidence, I suppose, of a well-functioning risk management framework. And that's really come to life since the own risk assessment was put in place. Why is that the case? And I think a big part of that is that the inaugural own risk assessment report made the risk management framework more concrete for trustees and employers. I think they now understand it because you have one document which brings them through all the various steps of the risk management framework, concluding with results, recommendations, outcomes. So I think it's much more clear and they understand where the risk KFH should be involved, etc. I also think that strategy of the employer and trustees can now, more clearly be reflected in the scheme's risk management framework going forward. We're in a better position to dive deeper into all the risks, but certainly some of the more opaque risks of the scheme in the next ORA. There's clear risk management contribution to trustees' decision-making process. I see that day to day in trustee meetings. However, it is clear that needs to be properly evidenced and documented in the minutes as standard, and also that the risk KFH, while needing to be consulted in some decisions, certainly doesn't need to be consulted in them all. I think there's a balance that needs to be struck there. And the final point is just that the expectations of the regulator are now clearer post the initial own risk assessment. Also, the supervisory review process, it's providing clarity gradually, and like this will evolve over time. So I think that's certainly going to be a big help. Just on to the next one, Brian. So just some thoughts, I suppose, on the next scheme risk ORA iteration and how the ORA may evolve. This slide deliberately poses more questions than answers. The first point I would say is that after the first own risk assessment was completed, the low-hanging fruit or the basics of the scheme are now in place. In other words, the obvious issues within the schemes have now been identified, recommendations have been put in place to remedy that. So what will the next own risk assessment look like? We could have a session on this alone. My own thoughts on it is that it will allow risk KFHs to go deeper into the risks. So for example, for market risk, if risk KFHs were looking purely at that as an individual risk, you can certainly break that out into, for example, concentration risk, given what's going on in the markets with potential government bond downgrades, etc. So I think you can certainly get a lot deeper in the second ORA than maybe was possible in the first one. Also, I suppose there's the point around the own risk assessment initially was presented as one large lengthy document. I think in the majority of cases, in the next iteration, will we see a static ORA approach document which lays out the risk management framework, how the ORA was conducted, what the process was, etc. Maybe in the standalone static document, and then there being a separate, shorter, dynamic ORA results document. Maybe that's something that would be appreciated by trustees. Also, I think something that's very topical at the moment is the industry has experienced a period of very benign market conditions. This may be coming to an end with trade wars, tariffs, all that stuff coming into play. So trustees and members' attitude to investment and funding risk may change over the next period of time. So how can the risk KFH support the trustees? And one of the more obvious, ideas that came to mind here is something that pricing actuaries in insurance, I think, are very good at, is where they perform this war game scenario planning, which is effectively kind of contingency planning. So you sit down with the trustees and you discuss what are the major risks that we would be concerned about happening that are outside of our control, and put in place a contingency plan with roles and responsibilities so that if it ever occurred, the trustees could implement a solution very quickly. I also think more sharing by risk KFHs on the evolving nature of pension scheme risk management would be of benefit to all of us. I would certainly be for having more risk KFH society events. I'd be just interested in getting your own feedback on that. So I'd ask Sim if she would maybe launch a poll for us, just to get just to see what your view on that is. Is it something that would add value? Would you engage in it? Would you participate? Would you be willing to present that, etc.? I think that would be very useful if you wouldn't mind just completing the poll for us, and I'll come back to the results of that at the end. I suppose the last thing, any own risk assessment, regardless of where they go, I always think of them as being kind of a summary of the 3-year cycle of the risk management framework journey that you had been on. So ultimately, I think trustees, should be in the car for the full journey that you're on, and ideally driving it, and that should very much come out of your own risk assessment. Just next slide, Brian, please. So just here I want to look at regulatory engagement, and then I'll just focus in specifically on the Pensions Authority supervisory review process. So all of this will be familiar, but just to remind you, I suppose pre the initial ORA, the regulator issued in November 21 a code of practice for trustees of occupational pension schemes. It was followed up 2 years later with a Pensions Authority risk conference, and then at the end of October we got, I suppose, what we were looking for in terms of guidance, which was the own risk assessments guidance for trustees, was published around Halloween. So, but since then, in terms of regulatory engagement, the key engagement, I think, has been via the supervisory review processes where you've had a scheme that's going through this. Many of these schemes that have been through the supervisory review process have now received final findings from the Pensions Authority and have received timelines for addressing the findings. And just an obvious point, but the ORA is obviously in scope of that SRP. And you need to effectively be able to answer the question, has your own risk assessment been prepared in accordance with Section 64A of the Act? So what is the Pension Authority supervisory review process? So again, I won't spend much time on this, but maybe just as a reminder, or if someone's not familiar with it. So the IRPS regulations gave the Pensions Authority additional powers to conduct a supervisory review of pension schemes. What is that review? Well, specifically, it's to assess the system of governance in place in the pension scheme, to assess the risk that the scheme faces on a looking forward basis, and also to assess the ability of the scheme to assess and manage those risks. And we know that in 2024, 6 master trusts, 1 very large DB and 1 very large DC scheme, were in scope of the supervisory review process. Just move to the next slide, Brian, please. So what does all this mean for schemes that have yet to be selected for this review? I suppose the first thing we would say, just an obvious point, is that all schemes will come into scope for a supervisory regulatory review, which obviously brings with it, the increased risk of regulatory supervision. I would expect that, if you haven't heard at this stage for 2025 for a scheme, then your scheme probably isn't going to be in scope. The review itself focuses on 6 specific risk areas, and it's just important to take this away, even if you haven't been through the process yet. So the Pensions Authority will focus in on the governance, operations, risk management, communications, investment, and fees and charges. They're the key areas that they look into. In terms of learnings from kind of having been through it, we did know significant time and cost had been invested in the process, as well as then post the process in terms of implementing the actual findings and putting them in place within the timelines provided by the Pensions Authority. The big question for me, I think, going forward is, will a proportional approach be applied by the Pensions Authority? So will a scheme with 1 million in assets have to go through far less rigor than a master trust with 5 billion in assets? You would hope so, and we'll see how that plays out. The last thing, just in terms of information provided as part of the supervisory review process, I would say just don't be in a rush to provide everything without checking the appropriateness of the information you're providing. So, for example, have you got, are documents legally privileged? You need to check that before you provide them. Also, even basic information like minutes, etc. You need to have at the back of your mind that could these potentially be requested from the Pensions Authority by pension scheme members as part of freedom of information requests, etc. So it's just, there's a lot to think about as part of the review process, even as basic as what information to provide. So what are the key learnings that I've taken from being involved in a couple of schemes that have been through the process? The first thing is the Pensions Authority are very big on governance frameworks. So I would maybe demonstrate that by saying, are the trustees living by their policies? So you put all these policies in place for trustees, but are they aware of the procedural elements they need to go through when they're making decisions, etc.? So you need to actually follow trustees, ensure that they're following their policies. How frequent are the meetings? The more frequent, the more alive the risk management culture is. And evidencing review of the work you put in front of trustees. So, file versioning, etc., is all very important. There's also the topic around the closing out of recommendations from the own risk assessment and the internal auditor. So by closing them out, you'll significantly reduce the time cost burden for the risk KFH, for the trustees, and for all the parties. Because what we've noted is where a recommendation is remaining open, that will get a light shone on it by the PA, which may trigger 12 additional questions and requests for further information. So without a doubt, the more of these that you can have closed before you got through the review, the more seamless it will be. The other thing as well, I suppose it's kind of key point, is where you've identified key risks in your own risk assessment, have you identified the additional controls via recommendations or some other method by which the trustees can control the risk? And I'm not necessarily talking here about controls that are existing, that are currently in place. It's what additional controls can be put in place to help to control these key risks. If they're not in the own risk assessment, I certainly got the impression that the Pensions Authority could potentially ask you to perform a revised ORA to amend that. So that's just something to be very conscious of. The other thing as well, just in terms of minutes, the Pensions Authority are very strong in terms of evidencing the decision making of the trustees. So to do that, you need detailed minutes. A good pension lawyer will probably advise you to go the opposite direction and disclose as little as possible. So there is certainly a trade-off there between disclosing too much and too little. So that's something I think that just needs a little bit of attention as part of that process as well. And then just on to the final slide. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through these, but these really are just 4 questions that I pose here. And hopefully, they can be developed further at society events in the future. So the level of engagement between the risk key function holder and the trustees. The second one is around, are trustees ready for an interview with the regulator without scheme advisors being present? And my view on that is, if you're an advisor to the scheme, the onus is on you to ensure that that knowledge is suitably passed on to the trustees so that they can competently sit in front of the Pensions Authority in an interview. We have heard anecdotally of some schemes engaging legal firms to guide them through the process. I think for the majority of schemes that would be excessive, and I think a lot of the burden and responsibility should fall on the scheme advisors. The risk KFH, the one thing I'd always say as well is just to be always conscious of the divide between the first and second line of defence. If you're acting in the first line in any capacity, and also acting in the second line, then are you simply checking your own homework? So, and that presents conflicts issues from my perspective. So I would always say, just ensure you're comfortably sat in the second line of defence and that you don't get dragged into first line of defence activities like the implementation of various DORA regulations, etc. And the last one, I suppose, is just looking into the future. We're still seeing the Irish pension industry consolidating, lots of different contribution schemes still making the decision to go to master trust, defined benefit schemes winding up. So I suppose the one thing for me is, in a post pension scheme consolidation environment, will industry-driven innovations in the risk space, be sought by the remaining larger schemes where potentially cost is less of a barrier? So I do think down the road there is potentially that scope for risk key function holders to add additional value, get into additional topics with trustees that haven't been explored to date. So I might just take a pause there and just ask Sim, is there results of that poll back?
Yes, I'll launch them now.
Great, thanks.
So the results should be up on everyone's screen.
Oh wow, okay, that's much higher than I would have expected. Yeah, so 91%. So that's pretty comprehensive. So I think there's a takeaway here for the society, which is, look, can we get more of these events in place? And I do think there's a huge element of co-learning that could happen in this space, and it's ultimately to everybody's benefit, including risk KFH in our day-to-day role, but also passing that knowledge onto our clients and ultimately in the members' interest. So I think that's definitely something that society can take away as a positive. Rob has been patiently waiting in the wings, so I'll hand over to Rob now, but please do engage in the Q&A at the end or write in any of your questions as we go along that we can tackle at the end of the session. And just want to say thanks for your time, and over to you, Rob.
Cheers, Tom. And yeah, I'll look to maybe finish within 15 minutes, so that there'll definitely be 10 or 15 minutes for questions at the end. So feel free to fire them in. Yeah, so just by briefly an introductory, just to note that yeah, I sit on the Sustainability and Climate Change Committee. It's kind of a cross practice area. So some obviously on the investment side, some members on the pension side, and but a lot of insurance colleagues as well within that group. So as part of our remit last year, we kind of surveyed members. I think it was maybe in the second half of last year. And leading on from that, I presented to the Pensions Council a couple of months ago, just to give them a feel of where things sat. And just a couple of slides I'll just run through maybe in a few minutes. If you can flick on there, Brian, just to give a feel for some of the key results. I think there might have been 7 or 8 slides in the total thing, but I've just kind of taken a couple of key ones here. The question asked here was in relation to sustainability and climate change, whether it's incorporated into members' work. You can see on the left-hand side there's a split by age. Maybe interestingly, well, I would have expected the bars maybe to be a bit different, maybe in terms of attitudes. You know, you often see that younger people are more engaged in this area than older people, but obviously, I think given maybe more the seniority within the membership, that actually the over 50 group is actually quite high versus the under 30s, who are probably just up to their neck in spreadsheets and can't see the wood from the trees. But you know, looking to the right hand side, maybe, which is maybe the more pertinent area that we chatted through with the Pensions Council, was noting that the pensions members were quite low, so just under a third were looking at this area in terms of their work. And when you compare that to obviously somewhere like general insurance, you know, over nearly 3/4 of that membership was looking at things. And again, intuitively, I kind of in my head think that the pensions members are probably a bit older than the average. Maybe there's not as much new blood coming into the industry as some of the other areas, but still, despite that, and maybe that kind of being more senior members on the pension side, you know, a pretty low and so standout number in terms of those that are using it within their work environment. And look, I think we all know, as Tom addressed, the last 3-5 years have been very focused on IORPS, on key function holder, you know, compliance, etc. And the regulator's view, I think, has also driven that. You know, obviously the regulations within insurance are much more onerous from a sustainability or climate perspective than what we have seen come from the Pensions Authority. Notwithstanding within the investment fund industry, I'd say that's quite a split. But it's interesting, I suppose, in the sense that arguably appreciate maybe less so in the DB space, but certainly in the DC space, you know, that's sort of where the longer term risks are, you would argue, and why, you know, you would expect that maybe this area should be considered that as things evolve into the future. One other slide I'll just again touch on very briefly. I won't go into all the detail here, but again, just similar color coding. You might veer towards the gray bars here, but you know, and similar maybe to Tom's query a couple of moments ago in terms of whether you want to see more events in the area of risk KFH. You know, the gray bar maybe in the second question there in terms of an area of interest to pensions members. You know, around half said that they'd like a broader understanding of the main areas. If you kind of go down to maybe the second last one, or sorry, no, the fifth one down, I think, the general introduction to concepts of sustainability and climate change. Again, you know, around half of the membership within the pensions industry kind of thinking that they'd like to see more in this area. So that was maybe one of the key aspects that we expressed to the council as well, that maybe it might make sense to have further events, and yeah, here I am today, I suppose, in that remit. But what we're seeing, I think, as well, and hopefully what you're seeing as well, when you log into webinars, I do think that sustainability is being incorporated into most. You know, it is quite pervasive in terms of how whether it's within the insurance space or within the investment space or within the pension space, in terms of how it's being thought about. So generally what we are recommending to the various member groups is that they do look to incorporate it into presentations just generally. but also I'd probably say just keep an eye out, because there's definitely a number of relevant webinars coming up as well. In terms of, again, maybe just spending a few minutes on the backdrop, similar to maybe had Tom address some of the aspects that on the risk side, but from a sustainability point of view, or like particularly, I would say the focus from a risk standpoint does come into it from a climate point of view. The graph, appreciate, well, there's a lot going on here in terms of the modeling, etc., that's done behind the scenes. But the graph on the left-hand side shows the performance of a diversified growth portfolio over the next kind of 20 to 40 years. And look, probably the key piece that comes out of that, and what it does is it allows for different climate scenarios, and probably the dotted line underneath there that kind of tracks the other underneath the other three shows that in 35-40 years a diversified growth portfolio, which is a portfolio that the average kind of member might be invested in, might be anywhere between 25 and 30% lower than if we have a more I suppose a transition to net zero, right? So I mean, that's the kind of, without getting into the weeds of it, that's the key reason why this area is obviously there's huge amounts of uncertainty in these projections, but that is one of the key reasons why it's high up the agenda from a regulatory standpoint. It's a destruction of wealth piece, I suppose. That's within that. Member pots being 25 or 30% lower, arguably inflation being higher in that scenario as well. And what we have seen, these types of projections on the left is some groups saying that they're not extreme enough. So to me, that's quite a material change. But some are saying that there's, and again, the Institute have released some papers in terms of the sting and the tail of these types of risks that maybe we're not thinking of or taking account of, kind of feedback loop aspects, etc. But look, that's the key context, I suppose, to some extent. The reason there's a focus on climate change is the fact that there's data available, and there's obviously the regulatory aspect, and I think there's that wider piece of the breadth of climate change in terms of how it impacts things, whether it's insurance risks, whether it's investment risks, whether it's people's individual lives, inequality, diversity, biodiversity, etc. So that it is quite a broad church and does impact the wider sustainability space, and I suppose that's probably the key reason why the focus is on that. The reputational aspect, I think, from a risk perspective, arguably shouldn't be ignored. Even looking at that previous slide and thinking that the pensions industry is a fair bit behind the curve, and I'd say the pensions industry in Ireland is a fair bit behind the curve. As an advisor, maybe that's something to maybe make us think about it a bit more. Fair enough, trustees have a lot on their plates and have over the last 5 years in particular. But I'd say I'm finding with clients maybe over the last 12 months, particularly maybe since that 22nd of April date last year, there's definitely been a bit more capacity for trustees. They're meeting more regularly. There's a better governance structure in place. There's obviously huge packs, but maybe there's nice dashboards and compliance checklists that are there that are making things more consumable. And I've definitely seen an increased capacity of clients being able to come back to their approach to sustainability and give a bit of time to it as well. So I do think that is an aspect that should drive things going forward. The third point on DC member engagement, again, I'm sure you've seen versions of this, but on the DC side, which is obviously where things are going from an industry standpoint, or where a lot of the focus is, having members engage, particularly that younger cohort, sustainability might be a key tool to get them engaged with the pension scheme. And certainly we've seen increases in communication, or how we're communicating with our clients and through into their companies, to try and get members a bit more, I suppose, engaged with their scheme, even looking at higher contributions, etc. And look, the other piece in terms of what are others doing, and maybe I'll touch on a few of those in a moment's time, but when we look across to the UK, which is obviously an interesting from I suppose standpoint from our perspective, all large schemes. So you think of most master trusts in Ireland, they would all be needing to provide a lot more detail and a lot more I suppose, a lot more focus on this area than the current legislation, I suppose, or regulatory environment is imposing on us now. So while we don't need to go to that level, it's an area that we should think about, I think, as well, and particularly as the, to Tom's point, that consolidation point, I think is really important going forward as well. So some actions again, I think, we just thought, was there something practical maybe that we could mention to the membership in terms of where can we go with this with clients? I think from our own standpoint, it is a matter, trustees have their own views on these matters. I think that's important. The same way as a trustee or a group of trustees has a view on diversification, whether they invest in hedge funds, whether they don't they invest in private markets, what their portfolio looks like at a general level. I find that most trustees or most schemes have a different approach to it, even though you're doing the same investments or similar terms, etc. There's no reason why the approach to ESG or sustainability has to be the same across a group of trustees. So I think it's in our role as advisors that we need to help trustees through that process and help them understand, these are some of the key areas that may stand out from a risk point of view, be it your exposure to certain areas, be it your long-term investment risk profile and how the climate or wider sustainability issues might affect it, and ultimately describe those risks for each individual pension scheme and build that into your framework. Okay, so there is a process that needs to be done. To Tom's earlier point, I think that the focus has been on maybe having ESG or sustainability within a risk framework, but without maybe some additional detail within it. So it is about defining those risks, I still think, at this stage. And ultimately, the second line there has it in terms of, well, how do you manage these risks? Well, you identify them, you evaluate them, and then you understand, do I need to manage them down or do I just need to monitor them over time? So just building that same process into your risk management framework. When you've done that, I suppose, and at least gone through some level of process, I think the stakeholder engagement piece is quite key, whether it's a sponsor on the DB side or member engagement in terms of the DC side of things. Having that information to hand is a key tool that you can use. The covenant I've just mentioned there, and again, that's something that we are seeing. I think, obviously in the UK, there's a very robust covenant environment there, but over the last, let's say, year, 18 months, that's obviously been a focus for Irish pension schemes on the DB side. As part of that covenant review process in the UK, climate change is considered, so again, that's maybe a point, whether it's a risk management function or the covenant advisor, however, or the scheme actuary, however that's kind of split up, is that something that's thought about or taken account of within a covenant assessment? I think is another area that can be thought about. And then resources wise, probably one of the good things, I suppose, about this area and some of the regulations is the transparency that's been driven. So, a lot of, as I say, the larger schemes within the UK have requirements of what they have to do in relation to disclosures, and they're actually publicly available. So you can Google, if you think of it, a lot of us are working in companies which might probably have UK arms. If you Google the DB pension scheme of X company in the UK, you'll find that you might come across a 60 or 80 page report. Within that report, you'll see, again, we don't have to do those reports, but you'll see a lot of useful information in terms of what others are doing, and maybe see some sound bites that you could look to incorporate into your own work as well. And finally, and probably related, the UK pensions regulator has a really good, even just Googling those exact 5 words, you'll get put through to a really comprehensive area, which also has actually a climate risk dashboard, which I think runs to 4 or 5 pages, which I'd probably say is a bit excessive myself. But even to take 3 or 4 aspects from that and think about it within the context of your own schemes, I think is again some low-hanging fruit that maybe in this second round of ORAs or in that inter-ORA period, that can give the ability for trustees to consider in a bit more detail. So that's it from me, I think. We were going to run a quick poll again, just before we pop onto the Q&A to see if I think if sustainability might be higher up your agenda over the coming 12 months, the bar to beat is 30%. I think that's probably the key one. So we can leave that run, Brian, if you want, and maybe we can move to the Q&A. What do you think?
Yeah, thanks very much, Tom and Rob. Very interesting, two really interesting presentations, and plenty of food for thought. We do have a couple of Q&A in already, and if anybody else wants to add any, please feel free to either raise the hand if you want to speak, or just submit it using the Q&A button below. So I'm just addressing the first question here, from Gary Colclough. First time round, auras and critical reviews all fell due at the same time, resulting in trustees having to access a lot of information in a short period of time. Do you think it will be the same next time round, or can we better stagger the meeting those requirements? I guess, Tom, you might have a lot of familiarity with that problem. I know you touched on it in your slides.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think with the auras, so there's definitely a very good argument, excuse me, to stagger out the production of the auras. So we know the requirement is, unless there's a need for an additional or ad hoc aura, and let's presume there's not. If there's not, then the requirement is that you produce an own risk assessment every 3 years. But there's no reason why you can't do one, for example, after 2 years and 6 months after the last one, and you do another tranche of auras for other schemes, 2 years and 9 months, and etc. So there's a very valid argument for staggering them out. And I guess the more engaged trustees would probably appreciate maybe getting the results somewhat earlier, I suspect, than the 3 years. And also in cases where maybe trustees are worried about supervisory review process being selected, there's a value add in terms of getting another maybe deeper second iteration of an aura and getting it done sooner rather than later. So I think the staggering of auras is kind of inevitable, to be honest, even for risk KFHs to be able to manage the workload. I think that's going to become inevitable. The other thing that I think of as well is, Pensions Authority previously did indicate that, they would like to see for defined benefit schemes, the auras being done at around the same timelines as the actuarial valuation, because there's a lot of commonality there in terms of funding, investment decisions, etc. So I think over time you'd see a lot of defined benefit schemes bringing their own risk assessment dates in line with the actuarial valuation dates, and then for the defined contribution ones, I think they will inevitably become more staggered. The critical reviews, to be honest, the critical reviews, now that effectively the process is in place around that, and I think everybody understands it, there's probably not as much work in that going forward, even though there is certain feedback from the Pensions Authority, I suppose, in terms of maybe where they can be improved. But I think the key piece in terms of staggering will be more on the own risk assessments, and maybe leaving the critical reviews, kind of leaving their next implementation date unchanged, I would say.
Thanks, Tom. And I see a question in there for Rob, actually from Anna Kinsella, just on I suppose, again, a point you did touch on, the Pensions Authority not currently compelling an awful lot of trustee engagement with the topic. I suppose not, which was obviously a big driver to a lot of the risk work that we have seen in 2024. Without that encouragement or I suppose compulsion from the PA, what do you think is the driver that's going to accelerate trustee engagement?
Yeah, without that, it's a challenge, right? Because some of these areas will lead to additional cost. But it probably is, well, say first and foremost, on the onus might be people on this call or on the wider space, I think, in terms of bringing it to trustees in a consumable way, and ultimately building it into how they approach that with trustees really as well, because that's going to be the key aspect in terms of getting some level of engagement from trustees is on us. The other aspect, well, there's probably two. Well, the other aspect might be when it's too late, arguably when something maybe happens that maybe we weren't all expecting, from a wider kind of economy standpoint, and then suddenly it becomes higher up people's agenda. That's probably the only other aspect you could probably think about. But yeah, I think it is on us maybe to bring it to trustees and to we don't have to go to the extreme, not the extreme, but the lengths, I suppose, that the UK has gone to. But certainly we can do more than nothing, I think, as well, or do more than the bare minimum that the Pension Authority have in place as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Rob. And I suppose something just occurred to me there when you were answering that is, I mean, unforeseen events. Obviously the current geopolitical dynamics, let's say, are presumably a bit of a push back, or I mean, certainly probably going to exaggerate the situation, the gap that your graph showed between the baseline and a kind of a worst case scenario, in terms of what the model outcome could be for a DGF given some of the changes happening at the moment. There hasn't even been time yet to think about that maybe.
Yeah, well, there's probably the more wider piece of like whatever about the last week or so, but the US and their current approach under the current administration to this area, which is probably pretty cynical to it, or thinking that it's not aligned with financial best practice or whatever it might be, or driving shareholder value, and that can go one of two ways, and it might depend on the day or the weather, arguably, in terms of how it might pan out. One is that, well, look, those, the sustainability and climate change area might be challenged, and the other is, well, look, the fact that less of a focus is on it in some areas, there might be more opportunities from an investment perspective, or even from a risk management perspective, that can be brought into it. So asset values fall quite sharply because of current dynamics. Maybe there's opportunities to invest as well. I think that's probably the only, maybe the other to the first question that was asked there a moment ago was, some trustee, I'm even just chatting to UK colleagues, some trustees in the UK are taking the view that there's a risk of missing out on strong additional returns if you don't incorporate that into how you approach how whether it's from a risk perspective or an investment perspective as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Rob. One has just come in there that I might address to you, Tom. I'm not familiar if you're a scheme actuary or not, but it is a question referring to the conflicts that can arise for actuaries that are taking on a dual appointment as a scheme actuary and a risk key function holder for the same scheme. Is it something that I suppose even in the PA engagement, have you seen anything on it in terms of whether they have any issues with that? Although I know they haven't done a lot of DB cases, or even just in general in your experience where it presents a challenge or an advantage, or is it very much dependent on the nature of the scheme?
Yeah, so what I would say is, so I'm familiar, like this is something that is commonplace across the Irish market. I mean, I think that's reasonably well understood. So it is a common situation where scheme actuary is performing two roles as scheme actuary and as the risk KFH. Conflicts of interest are a risk, right? Every risk you have to decide: do I accept? Do I accept, mitigate, transfer, reject? For that one specifically, my own view, and I'm not being overly pious on this, personally, I would always say to try to avoid the conflict, because I don't see what it adds for members having that conflict there, right? That's where I'd be coming from. So if I was the trustee of the pension scheme, I would say, well, what is this adding? Only it's an additional conflict that I need to document in my conflict register. And when I come to an SRP, and when I'm sitting in the interview with the PA, they will reasonably ask, you have this conflict, what's the reason that you're happy to accept it? And I'm not sure what the answer to that is. So for that reason, I personally would avoid it. But there may be situations where trustees insist on it, where they're very comfortable with their scheme actuary and they don't want to bring in somebody else. That's absolutely fine, on the basis that the trustees are then happy to be able to try and explain that away to the Pensions Authority as part of a supervisory review process. And to answer the other part of your question, have we seen engagement or dissatisfaction from the Pensions Authority on that specifically? The answer to that is no. But that will only, not to date, but I would only expect that to come out as part of the supervisory review, because it's not something that would come up as part of, an ORA assessment or anything like that. So I do think, though, that where you have that conflict, expect to be asked about it in a supervisory review process, and for your trustees to be able to answer the question why they're happy to take it and what value it's adding. And the other key thing I would say is just to ensure that it's documented in your register. So as I say, personally, I would try and avoid it, but if you accept it, just document it in your conflict register and have an answer ready for why it's appropriate for the scheme to effectively accept that conflict.
Great, thanks very much, Tom. I'm conscious of people's time. I suppose we're just creeping past 1:30. People may be keen to get their lunch before they go back to work. I would like to thank very much Tom and Rob for your time today, as well as all the time you spent preparing your presentations for today. Also thanks to Sim for your help with putting this the seminar on today, the webinar on today. And as I said, I'm with the CPD subcommittee of the Pensions Committee, so please feel free to reach out to me, anyone in the audience, if you do think of any great events that we could have in the coming months. And I certainly see from the response to the survey that Tom had that there's obviously a lot more interest for further risk key function holder events. So that's great to see. Thanks very much again to everyone. Enjoy your Wednesday afternoon and speak to you soon.